Osman was just 4 years old when he was locked down. His crime was his bloodline. Every new day could be the day he gets strangled. For 51 years, he was in solitary confinement. Any form of education or training was forbidden. No social contact, no knowing of the outside world. One day, the door opened, and they told him he was now the leader of the world's greatest empire. This is the story of the infamous cage system that was practiced for more than 3 centuries and slowly but surely self-lobotomized the Ottoman bloodline in the empire. In 1603, when it was first introduced, the cage was a humane alternative to something much more brutal: the legalized fratricide. Ever since its foundation, fratricide has been a part of the Ottoman Empire. Whenever a new sultan was crowned, he did not hesitate to remove all the possible rivals to the throne, which meant killing his brothers, uncles, and cousins. This was encoded in the DNA of the Ottomans, who emerged among many similar small states in Anatolia after the Mongols decapitated the Anatolian Seljuks, who had ruled the land for the last couple of centuries. The Mongols were smart. They knew that all they had to do was to remove the head of state. Then they would be left with a fractured power and order on their western border, which would ease their jobs at the other fronts. Civil war was only one side of Ottoman paranoia. The other was the Turkish nobility spread across Anatolia after the collapse of Seljuk authority. These families controlled land, armed men, and local loyalty. They came from the same warrior tradition as the Ottomans and used the same Islamic institutions to justify power. In practice, they were potential competitors for the rule. The Ottomans understood that as long as Turks held military or administrative positions, the power would accumulate outside the dynasty. The solution was the devshirme system. Instead of recruiting from Turkish society, the state staffed its army and administration with boys taken from outside the Turkish and Muslim population. These Christian boys, mostly from the Balkans, were removed from their families at an early age, converted to Islam, educated and trained entirely within state institutions. Their identity and status were tied only to the central government. From this system came the legendary Janissaries and many of the highest officials of the empire, including Grand Viziers. These men held immense power that cannot be passed to the next generation. The same principle governed the Ottoman family and the palace as well. Sultans did not marry into noble families. They took concubines. Almost all sultans were born to enslaved Christian concubines. The palace was also guarded and administered by eunuchs, enslaved and castrated palace guards. The army, the government, the royal family and the palace were all placed in the hands of non-Turkish, non-Ottoman individuals, who were legally slaves to the Sultan. This whole system was a tool to keep the power in the Ottomans. Yet, as we will see, in a few centuries, the Ottomans turned into a tool of keeping the power among these groups. The fear of civil war proved true in 1402, when Bayezid the Thunderbolt was crushed by the great Mongol commander, Timur, at the Battle of Ankara. The Ottoman, just over a century old, almost shared the same fate as the Seljuks. Once Bayezid was gone, his 4 sons started a civil war that lasted more than a decade, the interregnum. In some sense, all those wars were a long, dangerous and resource-wasting way of fratricide, since it ended with all brothers killing each other until only one remained. Half a century later, Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, legalized the practice of fratricide. For him, eliminating the potential threats to the throne was less brutal than having a war lasting more than a decade, killing thousands. For more than a century and a half, this was the practice. In 1595, Mehmed III had his 19 brothers and cousins strangled on a single night. The scene of 19 small coffins was too much for the people of Istanbul. Ahmed I, 13 years old when crowned, abolished the practice in 1603. No more fratricide. Instead, the young princes are now locked down in luxury suites in the harem. Best furniture, best silk, best food. No tutors, no training, no friends. To our adult minds, this is like a cool version of prison, like the ones they have in Scandinavia now. But remember, many of these princes were just toddlers when they got in. Also remember that they were as isolated as it gets. Many of them were stuck in their childhood mentally, socially, and emotionally for the rest of their lives. Now, what do you think would happen to an empire that raises its next king this way? Yeah, that is exactly what happened to the Ottomans. It broke down slowly but surely. Before the 17th century, the majority of the sultans were warrior geniuses, not by chance but by design. All young princes had their own regions to rule. Many had their little armies, running their own little campaigns and getting the best education imaginable from some of the best tutors in the world. And only the best of the best could rise to the top and become the next sultan. The Ottomans had this great meritocratic way of improving their bloodline. With a few exceptions, Suleiman the Magnificent was the last emperor who led his army to the battlefield. As many historians would agree, the golden era ended with him in 1566. Only a few decades later, the era of the caged emperors began. Instead of well-educated men with battlefield experience, now you have sultans eternally stuck in childhood. Some of them were just simply completely mad. Words cannot do any justice to the trauma of those people. They were institutionally and systematically lobotomized by the empire that they supposedly owned. To give some idea about the mental states of these men, let's look at some of the most notorious examples. Mustafa I entered confinement at age 8. He remained there until 26. When he was crowned in 1617, he was known as Mustafa the Mad. He failed to recognize faces, panicked during audiences, and reportedly tried to flee the palace in terror on many occasions. He was deposed after 1 year, restored briefly in 1622, and removed again within months. Ibrahim I was placed in confinement at age 7 and remained there for 17 years. When officials came to announce his accession, he refused to open the door, convinced they had come to kill him. As Sultan, he ordered executions based on suspicion alone and developed obsessive fixations within the harem. He was deposed and strangled in 1648. Mehmed IV entered palace confinement in infancy and was crowned in 1648 at age 6. He ignored council meetings, abandoned governance, and disappeared for months to hunt. State affairs were left entirely to others. He was deposed in 1687. And we have Osman III from the beginning of our story. When he was crowned after 51 years of isolation, he wasn't sane anymore. He was scared of women, loud music, and crowds. He sent all the musicians away from the palace. He wore steel-heeled shoes so that the women of the palace could hear him coming and hide. You might be asking how these men could govern one of the greatest empires of all time. The matter of fact is that they were not governing the empire. The people around them were. Remember the second fear we discussed: Turkish nobles gaining power, turning offices into hereditary positions, and challenging the dynasty. The Devshirme was designed as the solution. A class with no roots, no families, no land, no past. Loyal only to the Sultan. It worked too well. The Devshirme elite did not remain dependent forever. Janissaries began to marry, then demanded the right to pass their status to their sons. When the law stood in the way, they forced it to change. By the 17th century, they were no longer just soldiers. They were a political force. They revolted, dictated terms, and decided who could sit on the throne. After 1453, real administration followed the same path. Almost all Grand Viziers came from the Devshirme. These men controlled finance, war, diplomacy, and appointments. They knew how the empire functioned. While princes grew up in silence and fear, viziers accumulated experience, networks, and institutional memory. Inside the palace, power concentrated around mothers. Harem showed the way by breaking precedent and shaping succession. Kosem perfected it. She decided which sons would be protected, which would be sidelined, and which would die. She ruled through children, regents, and weak sultans, outlasting multiple reigns. Succession was no longer fate. It was management. The eunuchs made this control airtight. They regulated access to the princes, carried orders, intercepted information, and controlled the inner palace. A young sultan could not see, hear, or act without passing through them. You might ask why the sultans did nothing about this. The answer is simple. Most of them had no idea what was happening. Imagine the situation. You were locked away at 6. At 15, you are brought out and told you are the sultan. There is no father, no uncle, no brother, no grandfather. Everyone who could have taught you how power actually works is already dead. The only people you know are your mother, the viziers, the clerics, and the Janissary commanders. They raised you, they fed you, they speak with confidence and experience. To you, this is the state. You do not see interests or factions, you see order. If you comply, everything functions. If you hesitate, you learn the limits quickly. This was not theoretical. Osman II tried to curb Janissary power and reform the army. He was deposed, publicly humiliated, and murdered in 1622. Ibrahim the Mad was deposed and strangled in 1648 once he became inconvenient. Resistance did not lead to reform. It led to death. There is one more deviant who desires an honourable mention, Murad IV. Crowned at 11, he eventually understood what the system had done. He studied the empire's past and fixated on an earlier age of discipline, fear, and direct rule. He tried to revive it by force. He crushed revolts, executed officials, broke Janissary factions, and personally led campaigns, retaking Baghdad in 1638. He ruled as if the old Ottoman model could be restored through sheer will. He was successful too, until he died at 27. Some might say very conveniently. Whatever the cause, his death ended the experiment. The structure he fought survived him intact. In the long run, the Ottoman paranoia proved real, maybe in a way that the founders could never imagine. Their grand-grandsons were enslaved by the slave groups they put there in the first place. The sultans in the Osman bloodline were kept alive just for their legitimacy. The real holders of the power needed an Ottoman hand to put the seal. They made the rules, and the sultan pressed his seal. And if not, they sealed his deal and took the next boy from his cage. This was the story of the cage system that, in many senses, led to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. If you enjoyed this, you can subscribe for more.